One of the greatest Christian minds of the 20th century spent years fighting against God. C.S. Lewis, the man who would write Mere Christianity and the Chronicles of Narnia, once called himself the most reluctant convert in all of England. He didn't just doubt God, he actively despised the idea of him. Lewis looked at the suffering in the world, at the death of his mother when he was just 9 years old, and concluded that if God existed, he was either cruel or incompetent. Atheist to apologist. So what happened? What could possibly transform a man who mocked faith into one of its greatest defenders? The answer isn't what you'd expect. It wasn't a vision. It wasn't a miracle. It was something far more dangerous. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. Lewis read himself into belief. And today, we're going to trace every step of that journey, from the trenches of World War I to the midnight ride that changed everything. The wound of loss. Clive Staples Lewis was born in Belfast, Ireland in 1898. His early childhood was happy, filled with books, imagination, and the warmth of a loving family. But when Lewis was 9 years old, his mother Flora developed cancer. He prayed desperately for her healing. He believed God would answer. She died, and something in young Lewis broke. His father, consumed by grief, became emotionally distant. Lewis was sent away to boarding schools in England, some of which were brutal. In one school, the headmaster was literally insane and would later be committed to an asylum. Lewis felt abandoned by his father, by circumstance, and by the God who hadn't answered his prayers. With my mother's death, all settled happiness disappeared from my life. This wasn't just disappointment. This was betrayal. If God existed and let his mother die despite a child's desperate prayers, then God was either powerless or cruel. Lewis decided it was simpler to believe God didn't exist at all. The wound of loss became the foundation of his atheism. But what he didn't know yet was that this same wound would eventually lead him back. The Great Knocker. At 16, Lewis was sent to study under a private tutor named William Kirkpatrick. Lewis called him the Great Knock. Kirkpatrick was a fierce atheist and an even fiercer logician. He taught Lewis to question everything, to demand evidence, to tear apart weak arguments without mercy. Logic, reason, truth. Under Kirkpatrick's training, Lewis's mind became a weapon. He learned to think with devastating precision. He consumed philosophy, literature, and mythology. He excelled, and his atheism hardened into intellectual certainty. But here's what's fascinating. Kirkpatrick didn't just teach Lewis to reject God. He taught Lewis to think honestly. And honest thinking would eventually lead Lewis somewhere unexpected. If this journey is resonating with you, if you've ever wrestled with doubt yourself, hit like and subscribe for more stories of faith that go deeper. Because what happens next changed the course of Christian history. Lewis entered Oxford University at 19. He was brilliant, arrogant, and absolutely certain that faith was for fools. He had no idea that the very logic Kirkpatrick gave him would one day dismantle his unbelief. War and darkness. In 1917, Lewis's education was interrupted by World War I. He was sent to the trenches of France. What he saw there only confirmed his atheism. Mud and blood and meaningless death everywhere. Men blown apart by artillery. Friends dying in his arms. The horror of industrial warfare. Lewis was wounded by shrapnel in April 1918. He watched his sergeant, a man named Sergeant Ayres, die right beside him. Where was God in the trenches? Lewis saw no evidence of divine love in that hell. Only chaos, cruelty, and random death. The horrors of war confirmed my view that the universe was cruel and meaningless. When Lewis returned to Oxford after the war, he threw himself into his studies. He became a fellow and tutor in English literature. He was successful, respected, admired, but inside there was emptiness. Achievement without meaning, recognition without peace. Lewis had everything the world promised would satisfy, and it wasn't enough. Something was missing, something he couldn't name yet. The longing. Throughout his life, Lewis experienced something he couldn't explain. He called it Sehnsucht, a German word meaning inconsolable longing. It would strike him suddenly, reading a Norse myth, looking at distant hills, hearing a particular piece of music. A stab of joy so intense, it was almost painful. This longing pointed to something beyond the physical world, something beautiful and unreachable, something that felt like home, even though he'd never been there. Lewis tried to explain it away. It was just nostalgia, just brain chemistry, just aesthetic pleasure. But the longing kept returning, joy pointing beyond. As a literary scholar, Lewis loved mythology. He loved the old stories of dying and rising gods, of sacrifice and redemption, of worlds beyond this one. These stories moved him deeply, but he considered them just beautiful lies, imaginative fiction with no basis in reality. We do not want merely to see beauty. We want something else which can hardly be put into words, to be united with the beauty we see. He didn't realize yet that this longing was a signpost, and soon he would meet someone who would show him where it pointed. Dangerous friends. At Oxford, Lewis made friends who would change his life. J.R.R. Tolkien, Hugo Dyson, Owen Barfield, Charles Williams. These men were brilliant scholars, and they were Christians. This troubled Lewis deeply. He respected these men intellectually. They weren't fools. They weren't weak-minded. Yet they believed. How could intelligent people accept what Lewis considered absurd mythology? The faith of his friends began to crack his certainty. Tolkien, in particular, challenged Lewis's assumptions. Tolkien argued that Christianity was the true myth, the story that all other myths were pointing toward. The dying and rising God pattern that appeared in cultures across the world wasn't just imagination. It was preparation. The story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. This was new. Lewis had always separated myth from truth, imagination from reality, but Tolkien suggested they could be united, that the gospel was fact dressed in the form of fairy tale. Lewis wasn't convinced yet, but the cracks were spreading. The chess match. Lewis described his conversion as a chess match against God, and God was winning. Checkmate approaching. Every argument Lewis raised was countered. Every objection was answered. The philosophers he read, even the atheists, kept pointing toward something transcendent. George MacDonald's writings stirred the old longing. G.K. Chesterton's logic was devastating. Even the pagan authors Lewis loved seemed haunted by Christian themes. His worldview was collapsing from the inside. In 1929, alone in his room at Magdalen College, Lewis finally surrendered. Not to Christianity yet, just to theism. Just to the acknowledgement that God existed. I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. He didn't feel joy, he felt defeat. He was like a man who had fought a war and lost, but in losing he found something strange. Relief, as if a burden he didn't know he carried had been lifted. Lewis believed in God now, but he still wasn't a Christian. The final step would require something more. The midnight ride. In September 1931, Lewis had a long nighttime conversation with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson. They walked the grounds of Magdalen College, discussing myth, meaning, and the Gospels. Tolkien pressed the point that had been haunting Lewis. The myth became fact. The word became flesh. Days later, Lewis rode in the sidecar of his brother's motorcycle to Whipsnade Zoo. When they left, Lewis didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God. When they arrived, he did. Transformed. Lewis couldn't explain exactly what happened during that ride. There was no vision, no voice, no dramatic experience. Just a quiet crossing over. I know very well when, but hardly how, the final step was taken. The reluctant atheist had become a believer. Not in some vague spirituality, but in Jesus Christ, the myth that is also fact, the story that is also history, the God who entered his own creation to die and rise again. But this was just the beginning of Lewis's new life. The great defender. After his conversion, Lewis didn't keep quiet. The same brilliant mind that had once attacked Christianity now defended it. He wrote The Problem of Pain, addressing the very question that had driven his atheism: why does God allow suffering? He wrote the Screwtape Letters, revealing the strategies of spiritual warfare. Words as weapons. During World War II, Lewis gave radio broadcasts for the BBC explaining Christianity to a nation under bombardment. These talks became Mere Christianity, one of the most influential Christian books ever written. He made faith reasonable without making it cold. And then there was Narnia. Lewis poured his faith into stories for children, tales of talking lions and epic battles, and a world where good ultimately triumphs. Aslan the Lion became, for millions of readers, their first glimpse of Christ. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. The man who marked faith became its champion. The wound of loss was transformed into a gift of grace. Joy found. In his late 50s, Lewis experienced something he never expected: romantic love. Joy Davidman was an American writer, a former atheist and communist who had converted to Christianity partly through reading Lewis's books. They married in 1956, but Joy was already sick with cancer. Lewis watched the woman he loved waste away, just as he had watched his mother die decades before. The old wound reopened. The pain was almost unbearable. Joy died in 1960. Lewis was devastated. He wrote a grief-observed, a raw, honest book about loss and faith in darkness. He wrestled with God again, but this time as a believer. God has not been trying an experiment on my faith or love in order to find out their quality. He knew it already. It was I who didn't. His faith survived because it was built on truth, not feeling. Lewis didn't pretend grief was easy. He didn't offer cheap comfort. But he also didn't abandon the God who had found him. The longing he'd felt all his life, the Sehnsucht, he now understood. It was homesickness for heaven, further up and in. C.S. Lewis died on November 22, 1963, the same day President Kennedy was assassinated. His death was overshadowed by world events, but his legacy has only grown. 1. Mere Christianity still converts skeptics. 2. Narnia still introduces children to Christ. 3. His arguments still answer atheists. 4. His honesty still comforts the grieving. What can we learn from Lewis's journey? That honest doubt can lead to stronger faith than borrowed belief. Lewis didn't believe because it was easy. He believed because, in the end, he couldn't escape the truth. The longing that haunted him all his life was real. It pointed to a real heaven, a real God, a real home. Further up, further in. In the last battle, Lewis wrote of entering heaven with the words further up and further in, joy expanding forever. Depths never exhausted, home at last. There are far, far better things ahead than any we leave behind. The reluctant convert found what he'd been longing for all along. And his words continue to point others toward that same destination. From a grieving child who cursed God to a dying man who trusted him, the journey of C.S. Lewis shows us that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about following the evidence where it leads, even when it leads somewhere you didn't expect. Lewis didn't become a Christian because he wanted to. He became a Christian because he couldn't escape the truth. Truth found him, the longing that haunted him, the logic that cornered him, the friends who challenged him, all of it was God pursuing a reluctant heart. And when Lewis finally surrendered, he discovered that what he'd been fighting wasn't his enemy. It was his home. I gave in and admitted that God was God. That night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. Maybe you've wrestled with doubt. Maybe you've questioned whether God is real, whether he's good, whether he cares. Lewis wrestled too, and he found that the one he was running from was the one running toward him. If you made it this far, comment further up if Lewis's journey spoke to your own. Stay in the Word, stay in the Spirit, and watch what God does. If this blessed you, subscribe for more. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. See you in the next one.